Welcome to the webinar on Trump-Biden Uncovered. What will the US election results mean to Canada and the world? This evening's event is hosted by the Pearson Centre and Democracy House in partnership with the Canadian Club of Toronto. My name is Andrew Cardozo and I'm president of the Pearson Centre. Welcome everyone. As many of you will know, the Pearson Centre, founded in 2013, is a progressive think tank that addresses the big economic and social challenges of the day. And in that context, we've hosted some 30 webinars since April on the broad theme of COVID and beyond, as we seek to find solutions to the many challenges in the short and long term. Please keep in touch with our website, which is thepearsoncentre.ca, for the upcoming webinars that include a conversation with the new Green Party leader, Annamie Paul, on October 29th, followed by other webinars in the weeks ahead on issues like jobs and infrastructure and energy affordability and the long term of COVID and the healthcare system. Tonight, the night before the second presidential debate, we have a very special session that focuses on the US election. We will talk about this pivotal election in the United States and how the outcome will affect Canada and world affairs depending on who is elected. We have some 550 people registered for this session, and while the majority are Canadians, I want to say to our American audience, the election is not only about you, it is also about us. What you do affects us and many countries around the world. Just quickly on the format, we have an awesome panel who bring important perspectives to the discussion. Thank you for joining us. The panel discussion will last about 45 minutes, and then we will have time for a Q&A period with you, the audience. So please make sure you send in your questions through the question box, not the chat box, and we'll try and get as many of those questions in as possible. This session is being recorded and will be posted on the Pearson Centre YouTube channel later today. So for those who want to see it again, or if you want to tell others about it, or see any of our past webinars, just go to YouTube and search for Pearson Centre. Now, I'm pleased to tell you that our moderator today is Alison Smith. For more than 3 decades, she was a senior correspondent with CBC in many countries around the world. She was a Washington correspondent for CBC TV from 2005 to 2009, covering President Barack Obama's first election and inauguration. In recent years, Alice has hosted 3 seasons of the Foreign Affairs program Perspective for the political network CPAC, the American version of which is C-SPAN. And she is currently hosting a 3-part series for Hot Docs entitled America Votes. So with that, over to you, Alison Smith.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Well, we've got 13 days until official election day, and already you probably know that more than 40 million Americans have already voted in this election. There's clearly keen interest, and you know, if you talked about sort of where things stand, some more recent polling shows that Trump in some key states may be eating into what has been a pretty steady and well-established lead by Vice President Biden. It's not clear what tomorrow night's debate will bring, whether muting microphones will make a difference, because I'm sure you can't mute the microphone across the 12 feet that will be between the 2 candidates, but it will be one to watch. I would like to welcome our panelists, and let me first introduce Ambassador Bruce Heyman, who was the U.S. Ambassador to Canada between 2014 and 2017, and he's also involved with the Biden 2020 campaign. Along with his wife, Vicky, he wrote a book entitled The Art of Diplomacy, Strengthening the Canada-U.S. Relationship in Times of Uncertainty. And they have since founded an organization called Uncharted that's aimed at connecting diverse groups of Canadians and Americans. Elizabeth May is no stranger probably to most of you, but what you may not know is that she was born in the United States in a very active political family. Ms. May is a Canadian. She's well known as the former leader of the Green Party and is currently the MP for Saanich-Gulf Islands. Jamal Watkins is a lifelong activist, I think it's fair to say, but in his current role, he is Vice President of Civic Engagement at the NAACP, leading that organization's efforts to expand and involve African American engagement and involvement in democracy. And I guess that means get out the vote. And Mark Feigenbaum is a tax lawyer, and they're not as rare as you might think. He is a Republican who's originally from California, and he is chairman of Republicans Overseas in Canada. I welcome you all. So, you know, it's very hard not to follow the horse race. I think I look at polling for the US election almost as often as I look at COVID numbers these days. So let me ask you first, Ambassador Heyman, what you think the actual state of play is and if it's shifting at all.
So first of all, thank you so much for hosting today, all of the hosts, and I really appreciate the time that you've all taken tonight to come together to talk about what I believe is the most important US election of our lifetime, and perhaps the most important election in the history of our country, aside from the election we had during the Civil War. How are things? Well, here's where we are. Joe Biden has been ahead in the polls throughout much of the year. And the president has, unfortunately for him and his team, has not found a voice or a direction to consolidate, you know, his support in the Republican Party, nor has he found a pathway to inspire people for second-term leadership. Yet, at this point, we still have 2 weeks to go. We have an incredibly difficult time in America, as you know, with COVID. And our death rate is 222,000 and rising. We appear to be in another wave, whether it's the continuation of the second or first. It just doesn't matter. It's increasing pretty significantly. We have enthusiasm for democracy at a level I don't think I've ever seen in my lifetime. And I find myself to be a student of this, but also a participant in the election process. And I was a participant at a very senior level in the Obama campaigns, which I considered to be highly enthusiastic campaigns. But I think the threat to democracy as it is, the threat to the rule of law, the threat to our postal system, the threat to how we treat people, either through misogyny or racism or xenophobia or closing down our borders or the comments that are made, I think people don't really feel that this is the America that they would like to have. And I think that the turnout is huge, and we're seeing it both domestically and Americans abroad. So I'll leave it at that for now. We'll have a lot more to talk about, but we still have a couple of weeks and anything can happen. But more and more of the vote is getting banked early than ever before. I think we will have record turnout in terms of numbers and maybe near or at record levels in terms of percentage voting. And so that has to be a good sign for democracy.
Let's stay in the United States for a moment, because Jamal, you're speaking to us from Washington, D.C., and are actively engaged in trying to get out the vote. Do you see that same kind of enthusiasm that Ambassador Heyman referenced here, particularly among African American voters?
Well, first and foremost, Alison, thank you for moderating and hosting us. And it's good to see you, Ambassador, and our other colleagues. When we think about where we are in this political moment, the NAACP, we're a 111-year-old volunteer institution, nonpartisan, but we're not blind. And what we're seeing community after community is this level of frustration with what has happened around the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. We're seeing racial tensions being stoked like never before, at least in modern times, if you will. We're seeing community members really flocking to the notion that if they vote their values, if they vote and show up early, in many ways, this is going to hopefully shift the crisis that we find ourselves in, both in terms of the health pandemic, but also the residual effects in terms of the economic situation in our communities, the education crisis that is looming. And so when we start to add up what it is that's happening locally, and the ambassador, I think, framed it very nicely, people are actually going to vote a lot earlier because of the circumstances we find ourselves in. In fact, you know, my ballot is sitting on my kitchen table, and I'm going to be dropping it off shortly. this week because I know that I want to vote early and make sure that my ballot is in and my vote is counted. What's I think frustrating about this moment is disinformation and misinformation. And so while you do have this surge of individuals who are fired up and participating, if you go on any platform, say Facebook or Instagram, you can find just as many posts that are misleading or misguiding or offering confusion. And so at the same time that we have this groundswell of energy, we also have another side, whoever they may be, who are literally working probably just as hard to confuse the electorate and to confuse potential voters. And so my day job is literally about doing both and mobilizing and turning out voters and galvanizing that energy, but also countering the disinformation and misinformation that really is intended to thwart folks from voting and voting their values. So it's a very interesting time in the US as it relates to this political moment.
Mark Feigenbaum, I want to ask you, because I know that in some swing states, in spite of the heavy turnout in early voting, much of that is seen to be on the Democratic side, and some Republicans have taken heart from the number of registrations among Republican voters. How do you see the way things are at this point? Are you anxious, optimistic? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
All right. Thank you for having me, and maybe a similar but maybe dissimilar voice on the panel here. And I think it's remarkable as well, the early turnout. I think no one could have ever predicted this kind of number. So for people like Jamal, I have to give him a lot of credit for watching out. And I assume he means disinformation on both sides, I would think, that's going out. So he's being a watchdog for that and making sure people of all political institutions vote. And so I think that's a very interesting concept that people are very engaged this election. And I think a lot has to do with social media and the development of media over the generations too. So to answer your question though, the turnout that I've seen, which is remarkable, may not necessarily translate into a win for either party. The way the system works, that you could have very, very high turnout for only one person in one state, but that just gives them the state. So this is actually more of a math exercise, I think, and there's combinations and permutations and people who spend 8 hours a day going through all of the math, and there's pathways for either person to win right now. So no one's out regardless of the national polling.
Elizabeth May, when we spoke a couple of days ago, you used some pretty strong language, and you said that the country you were born in is in deep peril. I'm curious to know what you're referencing, and also what you think the significance of this election actually is.
Well, yeah, first I want to acknowledge I'm on the traditional territory with Saanich Nation and raise my hands to all of you, Haishkasiyam, which is in the language of the people of this territory, a welcome, a greeting, and a thank you. And to Mark, I just can't imagine anything worse than being a Trump supporter in Canada. You must find yourself very lonely. So I want to thank you for being willing to join a panel where you're, what I'm going to say next may offend you, but as Alison said in our pre-conversation, I think that Donald Trump presidency is actually the single largest threat since the U.S. Civil War to the integrity of the Constitution of the United States. Can it bear up where a president appears not to have read the Constitution, not to be aware of the limits of executive power, to be willing to say things that are blatantly untrue, to have failed his country so deeply in a time of a pandemic, to have fanned the flames of white supremacists for years now in allowing things to take hold that I thought were in the dark recesses of history. So, and it affects Canada as well. There's no question. We can't be self-satisfied or smug. We have elements of those movements within Canada, but I'm deeply concerned for the country of my birth. I am 100% Canadian. I didn't keep dual citizenship, but it's and I'm definitely not anti-American. I love the United States, and we are so dependent. I mean, as a parliamentarian, we all as parliamentarians, regardless of where we sit in the House of Commons, know that the U.S. is a key ally, a key friend, and we need to maintain good relations. And I think our current government has done a remarkably good job of being able to, for instance, negotiate CUSMA when we start out with a president who is extremely erratic. One moment he's friends with Canada, the next minute we're being slammed with aluminum tariffs, the next minute he's pulling out of the Paris Agreement and actually assaulting multilateral organizations globally in a way that is destabilizing. I mean, he's chosen his friends and buddies among the dictators of the world and anti-democrats and is eschewing the normal multilateral framework of modern liberal democracies. So yeah, it's a challenge. My heart is in my throat until this election is over, and then even after that, for what happens if there is a transition of power.
It's clear that President Trump has changed the world view of American leadership, and that there's likely, in a sense, no going back. So looking forward, what does American leadership look like going forward for either leader? What does the new world order look like, Ambassador?
So I think first and foremost, I think for us to be the world leader in the way that we, in at least some fashion, in the way we were in a previous administration, regardless of party, Republican or Democrat, I think we better get our house in order at home. And we have some repair work to do. The first and foremost thing that we need to focus on is this pandemic. We do not have a national strategy at all. We are not valuing our scientists. Our top doctor, Dr. Fauci, is being disintermediated from the coronavirus task force, or at least from giving good advice to the White House as to the path ahead. So we have to do that first. The second, I think we've got to buckle up domestically, economically. I think Jamal phrased it beautifully in terms of some of the other areas that we need to focus on. And then at that point, we need to reach out and mend relationships with our allies, because we can't tackle much of what we face in the world alone. This is not a by yourself kind of world. Pandemics aren't faced alone. Climate change isn't faced alone. You know, these are the kinds of things where you have to do it with partners and allies. And the president has, you know, shunned all relationships. In fact, I think that, and there was a report just released by Senator Mendez, which I was quoted in today, that I think that the president, Donald Trump, looks at relationships as disposable. And that's true on the international side. And so where we are, if it's a Trump administration, it's going to be xenophobic, it's going to be racist, it's going to be, we're going to be rounding up people and immigrants. He's going to use Bill Barr as his personal attorney. And we are going to have the greatest challenge to our democracy since the Civil War. And I agree with Elizabeth very much on this. If Joe Biden is president, we are not going to be able to go back to where we were, because of so much has changed. But he's using a term, build back better. I think that's true internationally as well, but it's going to take a fair bit of work. And we've got to rebuild the State Department, which has been so damaged in this process. So many people with so many years of experience are not there anymore. So we have to rebuild the talent. And then we're going to have to rebuild our embassies, and we're going to have to work on diplomacy in a way that we haven't done as a country probably since post-World War II, to focus on building the alliances that are necessary to tackle the problems of the world. So I think it's a stark difference. I think, this is, and let me just say this, and I think I'm in agreement with a number of people on the panel. I don't know where Mark's head is on this. I think having a two-party system and a functioning two-party system is really important in the United States. And having an effective Republican Party, whether I agree with their policies or not, that's different. But I need a party that respects the structure of our government and the rule of law and what our country's all about. I think we have a cult going on now. Donald Trump is a cult figure. He has a number of followers that are enablers, that he has a lot of people in the Republican Party who are bailing on him right now. We have Mitt Romney. He was the nominee of the Republican Party not that long ago, and he said he did not vote for Donald Trump today. We have Michael Steele, who was chairman of the Republican Party. He is supporting Joe Biden. I am part of the national security leaders for Biden. There are 700 plus of us, of admirals, generals, members of the intelligence agencies, former ambassadors, who are Republicans, Democrats, independents, and nonpartisans, all for Joe Biden because of the threat that Donald Trump poses to the United States.
Okay,
And so
I want to let Mark have a comment here, because I think it also can be argued that, you know, in spite of some of what you say, that, for example, NATO countries have pitched in a little bit more money, that a reckoning with China was coming, and that perhaps a tougher stand on China has opened the door for others to be tougher as well. Mark, how do you see America's leadership role in the world going forward?
Well, I'm feeling a little bit like the bottom of a pylon here right now. I think there's a lot of rhetoric and people. The doom and gloom around here hasn't been since, I guess, Noah built an ark of some kind. I mean, it's. I think maybe the hyperbole has gotten a little bit beyond where it is. I think a lot of people don't understand the powers of the president and the powers of Congress, and regardless of things he say, I don't think he can change the Constitution unilaterally. So I think if people were to, in the media and everybody toned that down and actually looked at the issues, I look at how the relationships would be with powers, and when not necessarily ally powers, but people who are going to come up against the U.S. and who are going to challenge the U.S., not necessarily militarily, but other ways, who's going to be the better leader that would stand up to them. And I think that's a factor of somebody we need to look at. I mean, the idea behind the president is one of the figurehead, but is also the person who's going to be the connection. And I think historically, there's been presidents that haven't had connections with Canada, have had connections with Canada. And so saying this is the worst of all time, or this is the end of society as we know it, I think is probably very excited. And it does get people out to vote. So, I mean, and it does give clicks on a page, but I think we need to look rationally at who we want to lead us in a time of trouble, or in the time of the economy after the virus, if and when it ends. Who I want to be in power to run the economy after that. So those are the kind of values I think people need to look at, and less of the dramatics, we'll say.
Elizabeth, did you want to comment? I could see your.
Oh, it's just so sad, because I look at Donald Trump and think, how is it that someone with actually no experience, meaningful experience to understand the economy, nor to understand civil society, nor to understand democracy? I mean, he essentially has an entirely earlier, the discussion about maybe he sees people as disposable and relationships and allies as disposable. I think he actually sees things in a very much from his reality TV show of doing a deal. And you're going to do a deal, you're going to bluff, you're going to pretend you've got. It's not healthy in a multilateral context. It's not healthy as a way to treat your allies, and it's a bravado in the and there doesn't seem to be a moral compass, which is another aspect of his conduct, which makes us all hope that there'll be a change. And again, I would say, Alison, it won't be automatic that the U.S. is able to regain the prestige it once had. It's going to be work to figure out what does a new international order look like, and how do we get to a place where, for instance, global response to a pandemic has to be global. Global response to the climate crisis has to be global.
Right. So let me ask you this, and this is based a little bit on what Ambassador Heyman had to say, and also a bit on what Mark had to say. Assuming the United States, no matter who's elected, has to think about what's happening within its own borders first. What does that mean for a country like Canada, a middle power like Canada? What role, no matter which president at this point is elected, what role does that suggest for a country like Canada?
For me, I would say absolutely. Canada has been forever the U.S.'s major trading partner, closest friend and ally, and essentially part of the same family. Now, that means in the context of, let's not just forget what's going on within the United States this year. Not only did we see the protests of Black Lives Matter after the killing of George Floyd, we also saw an unprecedented a climate firestorm killing people who are our friends and neighbors through Washington, Oregon, and California. We saw an unprecedented hurricane season on the eastern seaboard. The climate crisis is ravaging the United States. And I think for Canada, it means a willing partner and friend where we can resume the conversation where we left off and build our economies back better together by facing these challenges together. I think it's actually, we're in an ideal place as Canadians because we love the United States and a ton of our families are just across that shared border. We've got to find ways to establish once again strong, healthy relationships diplomatically, in terms of trade, economically, and in terms of climate action.
What, Ambassador, you've been in the middle of that. I mean, what role does it suggest to you for a country like Canada?
So I think Canada has one of the most important roles going forward in the world. I mean, we have these large powers that are now setting up against each other. And in some ways that puts you in a difficult place. In other ways, it could put you in a really great commanding place diplomatically around the world. And so I actually, know Ambassador Bavre, and I think he is going to continue to be, and his language, even this last week, quite strong and appropriate. But I think he is going to continue to be a great leader for you in the UN. But I look at, if we're in a multilateral world under a Biden administration, Canada at our side will be critical for executing so many of the goals that we have, starting with climate change, starting the U.S. re-entering the Paris Accord, but also dealing with our shared environment that we have. We have the Great Lakes where, it's water for 40 million people, drinking water. And then we have the Arctic that is melting, but, the Trump administration wants to renew drilling there. And I'd like to see that change. I also see Canada's role in North America. Now, remember, and I was there in attendance for the last Three Amigos Summit. Now, you can't even imagine calling it a Three Amigos Summit at this stage of the game. That's the kind of language and treatments coming out of Washington right now, specifically the White House, toward Mexico and toward Canada. And make no mistake about it, these relationships are fractured and they will need to heal. And, Elizabeth is right. It's going to take a while to regain trust, and it's going to have to take a lot of work. But it's going to be really important because of the issues that we're tackling geopolitically that we'll need Canada to be with us at our side doing that. And it's really hard for Canada to do that when the value system is not aligned between our countries with regard to the treatment of women, the treatment of people of color, the treatment of immigrants, how we think about climate change and the focus on that, the treatment of NATO, which I have some very specific views on about, people coming up with more money or not. And then, and then the operations around the world. And, Donald Trump is clearly butting up with Putin. And, this is very jarring, especially at a time where the Russians are being indicted this week for interfering in our election. And look, we have one last thing, and I'll just say it. We have more than 500 children who do not have their parents today because this administration stripped them away from their mother's arms and sent those parents away, and they lost them. And so now we have more than 500 children at our border. This is not the America that I know or I want to live in. And we need to get some serious changes going on very quickly. And I'm hopeful that it's in 13 days.
We know that, to a certain degree, all politics is local, as the old saying goes. Jamal, I wanted to ask you this because do you, in the voters that you speak with and in sort of the campaign that you're involved with to encourage people to vote, to what extent is America's role in the world play a part, and how do they see it going forward?
Well, I would say first and foremost, the notion of thinking globally and acting locally is in the America that I live in and in the Black community in particular. And when we talk about the bottom of a pileup, I would say that Black Americans know that all too well in very real terms. And so when we think about the notion of what was lifted up just a second ago, this whole concept of protest as it relates to police brutality, when you have the sitting president of what we call the free world, so sort of discounting what should be the application of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, thinking not just civil and political, economic, social, and cultural rights. What we find is this bit of irony that if the rest of the world could recognize that what the Black community in America is experiencing is a fundamental violation of their universal rights, if you will, then there's a disconnect when our leader is not seeing that vision, or when that same leader disparages countries that have large populations of the African diaspora. It sends a signal that all of the trade deals, the failed economic policies that have created manufacturing jobs and jobs that actually keep the Black community employed and communities of color employed is connected to this global framework that is completely offset. And I would say fundamentally what we're most frustrated with is when you hear, and again, we are a nonpartisan organization, we're a C4 and we're not blind, so we can speak truth to policy power. When a president says that he has done more for our communities, let's look at the past 4 years. COVID-19 alone and the health disparities, the attack on the Affordable Care Act has really decimated our health security, if you will, in the Black community. Then when you start to roll in things like the economy, you see that it doesn't add up. We actually benefited from the previous Obama administration, and now that the economy is starting to settle, Black folks find themselves in these low-paying jobs. And so when you start to add it, it's the notion that if you are suffering locally in the United States under a leader who doesn't see your community and value your community, then just imagine what that means for the African diaspora in places like Canada and other countries where anti-Blackness then becomes the trend. Because if America is saying it's okay, the sitting president is saying it's okay, then it somehow justifies that democracy is giving a pass to foreign governments around the world who say it's okay to use anti-Blackness to not only meddle in our elections in 2016, but to continue to undermine the fabric of our democracy. The whole Cambridge Analytica story that broke in regards to deterrence. So it's completely frustrating and at the same time factual that we are dealing with a leader that is inadequate, that drums up racial divisions, and in my opinion, and the opinion of our organization, is driven by power and money and not by making sure that America is the healthiest and the strongest that it ought to be.
Yeah. Mark, I want to draw you in on this conversation because I'm curious to know about the sort of the core values that Republicans find apart from Trump, because we talked about this when we spoke on the phone a couple of days ago, the idea that, of course, we are all focused on the presidential campaign and that offers the great theatrics, but there are Senate races and House races going on as well, and that there are sort of core Republican values that have played an important part in American civil political discourse for generations. Tell me what the core values are that would drive, for example, Republicans overseas in Canada to vote Republican on the ticket this time.
Well, thanks. I kind of want to step back and set the stage for that answer. And the ambassador and the member said how they have to clean their own house, they have to look internally at the U.S. And then later we talk about fixing some Arctic ice things or whatever. So we have to choose which one are we working with. And I think that they were correct in the first step, is that the U.S. has a lot of issues right now and needs to clear those up. And they have to be cognizant of other forces that are coming in. But I think it's interesting that we would expect any country to not be friendly with another country, but not put themselves first. Like you wouldn't expect a country to say, well, this isn't really good for the U.S., but it's better for Canada, so I think we'll do that. So what I look at is how is the U.S. going to manage itself and on what basis? And as I mentioned before, the president has limited powers, regardless of what's reported and everything. And the legislation comes from the House and the Senate. And the House is likely to stay Democrat. I concede that. It'd be very, very unusual that it wouldn't. But if the Senate remains Republican, which is a likely conclusion, then how would a Democratic president have all these dreams and talked about all these things that he's going to do, but be limited in his power just like everyone else? And so maybe we'd want a Republican president. And the values I'm looking at are the vice president and the senator said flat out they're going to cancel the tax cuts. They made it clear it was only for the rich, but we all know the tax cuts affected everybody. And to say not is disingenuous. So do people want to all of a sudden start paying more taxes now? The culture of the US is they don't like that sort of thing. What about trade? We look at Canada and we again look at the character of the president, but actually the trade policies, which are very similar between the two parties, but the trade policies would actually benefit Canada if it's a Republican government, the Senate or the president. And so I think we have to take the face off a little bit of what we're all arguing about and this particular personality or whatever, and look at the values of republicanism: smaller government, lower taxes, less burdensome. And what do we need? What bear do we need to put the country back on track, particularly when the pandemic's done? So many people are unemployed because of that, nothing that the president did to employ people. And so how can he put us back into the right track? So I look at this: who do I want to lead in putting it back on track economic wise and building, like everyone said, cleaning their own house up.
Alison, if you don't mind, I want to jump in here and just say, when we think about this notion of the balance of powers truly being balanced, it's not true. I live in the city of Washington, D.C., if you will. We are not a state. Per capita, myself, my family, our neighbors pay more taxes than any other state in the union, yet we are not represented as a state, meaning we have taxation without representation. So if we were to take Mark's line, when I hear the president of the United States say making DC a state would be a big mistake for the Republican Party, then that's saying to me, you don't care about tax fairness. You don't care about big government dominating my life and my world. You actually care about a balance of power that is partisan. And so when we look at these kind of variables, if we're going to speak truth to power, then we have to call the question, what is the motive behind policy decisions and leadership connected to this framework? And it's not actually about austerity politics, if you will, or making sure that taxes are lowered for the middle class. It's about partisan politics that don't see me as a taxpayer, for example, in the District of Columbia, who deserves to have taxation with representation.
If I could just respond quickly to that, as well, that's on your license plates, or used to be. That's been since John Adams was president, so I don't think President Trump has affected that so much. And so a lot of people have very valid complaints about residents who live in the District of Columbia. I don't know if that's a signaling virtue of any president from the last 40 of them that should be an issue.
We were starting to get some questions from the audience, and Mark, I'm just going to come back to you for a moment. This person asked, how has Trump and his Republican Party affected the conservative movement in Canada? And I'll come back to you, Elizabeth, on this one too.
I think it's more not conservative as much as it's a populist wave across the world. I think leaders are across the world and are attracted now in this cycle of things, and it may go back in a generation as well, to somebody who's speaks more to them and not at them. And so when we say conservatism in Canada, I'm not sure that we're talking the same thing as republicanism in the US, but using the same I guess spectrum or whatever. I'm not sure it really affects so much, because I think a lot of people do have the same values as Republicans and are just being not as vocal about it. And then the same thing in Canada, a lot of people aren't as vocal about being pro-conservative, but vote that way anyway. So the best polling and all that always takes place on the voting day, where it's a secret ballot and people can voice their mind without being looked at.
Mm-hmm. As someone still in the political trenches, Elizabeth, how do you think Trump's and the Republican Party have affected conservatives?
Yeah, and I think there is a very legitimate historical role for the Republican Party in the United States, and I think Trump is an anomaly. In the same way that I think conservatism in Canada and the progressive conservatism of Brian Mulroney and Joe Clark and other leaders who really were progressive as conservatives was betrayed by the anomaly that was Stephen Harper, and we're not through that yet. The difficulty I have is lumping in Trump with Republican Party or conservative values, what I see happening to Canada, and I hinted at it earlier, I never thought I would see a rise in white supremacy in Canada. I didn't think I would see its existence. Trump has given oxygen to some extremely, and for short form, evil forces in the world. I don't think populism, as described, is really the kind of populism, the prairie populism that gave rise to Tommy Douglas, bears no relationship whatsoever to the brand of populism of Bolsonaro or Trump, which flirts with fascism. So we really have to be clear in our definitions, and I think we have to hold out that Trump is an exception to the rule. I mean, I think his personality and his celebrity and his willingness to say, as he did some decades earlier, if I run for president, I'll choose the Republican Party because they'll believe anything. His brand of politics seems to have more in common with P.T. Barnum than Abraham Lincoln. There's a sucker born every minute, and Trump knows how to exploit them. And I think that this period of time for the world has been dangerous, but it has made, like, we Proud Boys, let's face it, it's a terrible thing to have on our record as Canadians, but it started in Canada. We are seeing systemic racism within our police forces, particularly anti-Indigenous racism, which we must name and work on hard. We're not immune from these dark forces in our country. But we do tend, and again, this goes back to de Tocqueville. So if you're going to look at a nation and say over a period of several hundred years, we have certain characteristics that differentiate us from the people we love south of the border, we are more focused on what's good for all of us together as community, much less focused on singular individualism. And I hope we hold on to that as Canadians because it's not preordained.
Here's another question, and Ambassador Heyman, I'm going to put this to you. Can electoral reforms ever happen with regard to the Electoral College? You know, in Canada, we're still debating proportional representation. Election reform is a touchy, difficult, contentious subject. Is that part of the problem in the United States, and is it something that should be reformed?
The answer is everything should be reformed as we can find paths to improving the processes we have. And I think that there are a number of states that have found a way around, and if we can get affirmation by enough of them, a number of states have found a way around to deal with, without changing the Constitution directly, how to deal with the Electoral College. And that is supporting the popular vote of the country as to how that they will allocate their electors, and only doing that, though, if enough states all come together to do that such that it becomes validated. And so this movement is afoot, and there is a process that could possibly get us to that. I would also say gerrymandering is a huge problem in our country, and we're doing a census right now, which will then develop into reapportionment and how each congressional district, or your ridings, how each are drawn and how they are redeveloped within each state. And that sits for a decade. And so the key for us, I think, on the Democratic Party is to get as many state legislatures as possible so that we can fix some of the gerrymandering that had taken place in Republican legislatures over a period of time, such that we find states that are voting substantially Democrat, but have significantly less number of Democrat representatives in Congress. So that has to be worked out. But we also have, and Jamal could talk to this because I know, his organization is focused on this, is voter suppression. And the reality is that we just need to make sure that the people who want to vote, who are legally allowed to vote, can vote and their votes count. And the Republican Party is doing their darndest, whether it's in Texas to having one drop box in each county so that Houston, which has millions of people, has one box, or dismantling mail services, or kicking people off the voter rolls, or waking up and finding people in Atlanta 10, 12, 15 hours in line to cast their ballot. This is wrong. This is just not how we should do this. So electoral reform is a large topic, and we need to deal with how everybody votes all along that process. I am hopeful that if we can get the votes out that we need this time, that we'll begin to make further progress in that path.
Here's another question from the audience. Jamal, I'd like to put this to you. to what extent has the American media exacerbated divisions in the United States?
Well, when you start to think about our media complex, if you will, when you look at, say, Fox News, which is, on the conservative side of the aisle versus the CNNs and MSNBCs, what you see is news being reported very differently. It's almost as if it is the light side and the dark side, and you pick whichever side you want as light or dark. But for us in our communities, what we're finding is that when you start to do the analytics, the role of the media in terms of perpetrating and pushing out anti-Black sentiments, anti-Latinx sentiments, anti-any community sentiments seems to be in accordance with the rise in hate crime. So in 2018, we hit a spike in the number of violent hate crimes. It was a 16-year high. And when you start to look at the correlation of what gets reported in the news cycle, it literally is about these racial tensions and racial divisions. And so for our organization, we have been a part of trying to counter this through the online versions, which we formed an entity called Stop Hate for Profit, where we saw that big platforms like Facebook, which is not a traditional, it's not a media outlet per se, but the ability to actually—
How most people get their news.
Exactly. And the ability for it to spin news that was deemed as being fake news, but not being countered or taken down through their algorithms, actually showed us that that's at the core of the problem. And so when you think about, hate crimes, when you think about this notion of fake news, what you get is, a lone wolf, say, for example, who was socialized in a Facebook group who goes on a killing spree in Wisconsin. And so for us, we're connecting the dots that we want to return to journalistic integrity, where news is actually being reported in a way that's at the highest standard and not utilized as a partisan tool. And that's the hard part, I think, about where we are, is because sensationalism sells, violence sells, all of the things that we are actually trying to counter sells. And so in this moment, we're very clear that news outlets have a responsibility to do things differently, to handle business differently. And until we see change in the political leadership in terms of the appetite to move in that direction, you're going to keep having more and more of what we're seeing now in the US.
Mark, did you want to jump in on that? I can see you.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the electoral reform because I find it interesting. Everyone always screams when they lose, and either party, I guess, would do that. But the electoral college is fascinating, and they obviously changed it in the early 1800s because the second place person used to be vice president. But the way that it's for the last 3 decades is actually, I think, favored a lot of the Democrats. When you think California and New York you're looking at 70, 80, you're going to get those. And then there's about 50 votes in the states, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, those ones. So you're starting, as I say, on third base. You already got those. It's not the era of Reagan or McGovern lost every state. You just don't see that. So for them, but what's fascinating about the electoral college and why I think it works well is that it looks at demographic shifts. Now people have moved to the south from the north. And so now the South becomes an important part. They didn't want in history to have, at the time, New York and Virginia pick the president every time. And with popular vote, we could end up having 3 states pick the whole president. Does that really represent? So I notwithstanding your comments about gerrymandering or whatever, I think that there's maybe a broader discussion over the course of history for but you can't say just because it's not a popular vote contest that it's an unfair contest. And I think that's disingenuous.
Well, I think, Mark, in a democracy, it's pretty fundamental that the party and the individual running for president or whatever that gets the most votes should win the election. That's sort of fundamental in a democracy. And so it's a characteristic of very few democracies around the world, but it is a characteristic of Canadian first past the post and US voting, the problem of the quote unquote, and this is a lot of academic work on this, the wrong winner problem. The individual, the party that gets the most votes doesn't, in our context, does not always get the most seats, or gets, in fact, a majority where only a minority of the popular vote went to that particular party. Minority parliaments, of course, the US is a 2-party system and enforced and hardwired in that you register to vote you register at 18, you're a registered Democrat or a registered Republican. Most Canadians never join a political party. We've been multi-partite, 4 or 5 parties in Parliament since the early part of the 20th century. There's lots of differences between the two systems, but the one thing they have in common is perverse results compared to how people actually voted.
But just for a quick second, though, that means that basically if I were running for president, I would only visit Texas, California, New York, and Florida and give all the money to them. Because if everyone in those states vote for me, then I've won. That's not, what does that say to the rest of the population, how their vote counts, right?
Well, right
Well, I
now
would say
it's
that-
just Florida, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So that's where we are. I mean, you know, they're only visiting a handful of states. And you may say, wow, they'd only go to the big states. Well, right now they're only going to a handful of the swing states. So just a few states are actually, you know, picking the president.
But
But it
that's a
isn't because of the
benefit for
population.
Yeah, Jamal, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would say that I think we don't want to miss the real reason why the Electoral College is problematic. It's that the winner takes all in most states. That's the problem. And so in Michigan, if you win by, 10 votes versus a million votes, you get all of the spoils of that victory, so to speak. If proportionality was the rule of the day for all states relative to the Electoral College, then it'd be more balanced in terms of representing the majority rule, if you will. And so for our perspective, that actually ends up being problematic. It's not to say that the small state bias is the problem. I think that's a bit overrated. It's about the notion that you should actually be looking at whether or not the Electoral College actually matches what the majority of the country wants in terms of electoral outcome. And we didn't see that in 2000 or in 2016. And that's when I would say we have to question whether or not the system itself is actually operating in a way that benefits all Americans proportionally, as opposed to what we're seeing now, which is this sort of winner takes all in certain states, which then it actually feeds into this problem of not recognizing the majority of the will of the voters.
Okay, this is an interesting question, and it probably is a good way as we head into the final few minutes here. What is the future of the United States, given, and there's a premise, given that Trump is a symptom of the system, not an outlier? Here's the question. Jamal, let me put it to you first. Are there 2 Americas that are solidifying themselves here?
I would say that there's 3 Americas. So there is the reality that, there's a group of Americans who I think are longing for the days of past. And in some of those cases, it's probably a very mythical longing because, America has gone through its struggles to get to where it is today. We just celebrated this year the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage. So if you want to go and say that's when America was great, then that means more than half of our population didn't have a political voice. And so when we start to think about that, I think that's a reality. Then you have a grouping of folks who are really looking forward to how do you have a revolutionary America that's transformative, that all of our institutions have changed, et cetera. And I think for most Americans, they're squarely in the middle. Most Americans want to be able to provide for their families, have health care, have a decent life, part of something positive and progressive in terms of making sure that they can contribute to the global ecosystem. And we're being pulled by these 2 polar opposites in ways that I believe are unhealthy and are fragmented and really dividing us. And so when I say there's 3 Americas, the notion for me is how do we get back to the fundamentals that if we are going to be about the people, then let's find policy solutions and leaders who are willing to invest their time and capital to make life better for the majority of Americans, period. But because that's not where we are, we're fighting these extremes, and we end up actually hurting the majority of the population, both economically, in terms of policy, in terms of race relations, the list goes on and on. So for our organization, we're looking for leadership that is about policy solutions that benefit the majority of Americans, that are racially inclusive, and that actually lead us forward in the right direction, as opposed to sort of catering to these polar opposites that don't really speak majority.
Mark, let me put that to you. Do you see 2 Americas solidifying themselves here?
Well, I'm hoping it does, and I think the honourable member Parliament talked about the sore loserism, I think was the quote. And we have to be a little bit cognizant of the fact that whatever the outcome of the election, the world has to go on, and the the government has to support the people and the people have to support the government. And that was the way the vote went on either side. And I think over the last few elections, people have moved away from that. Is it the fact that, you know what, my preferred person didn't get in, so now I don't want to, that's not my.
Anymore. Yeah.
If I could just jump in, well, just to correct that, Mark, it's not a sore loser issue. It's an actual academic political science term, the wrong winner, meaning that the person who claimed the White House was the person with fewer votes than the person who lost. That isn't healthy in a democracy. But I will say, I hope very much that this is the moment, which hasn't been discussed among us yet, which is, of course, that this global pandemic is unlike anything we've experienced in terms of its wrenching impact on societies. We haven't had anything like this since the Second World War. We have a moment here, which is a global moment, and some would call it a hinge moment in history, to actually rethink things fundamentally in the way that we did post-war. My parents' generation, some of you are way younger, but the Bretton Woods conference moment. A new president post-pandemic with other global leaders can start reimagining the rules of the game for the economy, for social justice, for eliminating poverty, because no society can survive if it solidifies into two different countries. That is not healthy, and it's not in the interests of even those within American society right now who believe firmly that Donald Trump is their savior. As has been documented for years, people voting against their own economic self-interest by thinking the billionaire class is really on their side. This is a moment for rethinking the basic assumptions of what a government does on behalf of its citizens in a democracy.
Ambassador Heyman, I want to give the last word to you as we come to the close of this and ask you about the divisions, because they are obvious. Some of them are not new. But do you worry that America is solidifying into two Americas?
So that takes us to the election. The name of our country is called the United States of America. We have a president today who is dividing us. He is dividing us based on race, religion, nationality, gender, sexual orientation. He's dividing us, our cities in the north versus our rural in the south. He's dividing us in ways that are solidifying along this comment, this division of this country. I think, though, that the leader of our country sets the tone and the direction and has the ability to bring us together as the United States of America. And so it's not an easy task now, because we are significantly divided as a result of this. We're even more divided, rich and poor, because of just tax legislation that has gone into effect. And the gap between rich and poor is quite wide in our country. Healthcare services, quite wide. We are divided as a country, but we have a chance right now to bring it together. I'm going to leave you with one story that may give you at least a sense of the man, Joe Biden, who I know personally, and can give you an idea of who he is and what he's all about. Vicki and I had the opportunity to attend a state dinner for Angela Merkel. It was in the Rose Garden. And we were at that dinner, and seated at our table, I don't know how it happened this way, was one Joe Biden and Dr. Joe Biden, and one Senator Mitch McConnell and his wife, Elaine Chao, Vicki and I, another couple. And we had given the toast. Everybody stood up. Barack Obama stood up and to give a toast to the Chancellor, Angela Merkel, and to the relationship between the US and Germany. And we were getting ready to sit down at the table. And Joe Biden said, wait a minute. And we're all, okay. Vice President says, wait a minute. We all wait a minute. We stayed standing. And he reached all the way across the table with his glass. And he said, Mitch, to compromise. And we all toasted our glasses. I could just pinch myself. I remember it as if I was sitting there at this moment. Not a short period of time later, there was a budget disagreement, one of many, between the Democrats and the Republicans. And Mitch McConnell was having a difficult time with Senator Reid. And he said, I'm not going to negotiate with him anymore. And they said, who will you negotiate with? And he said, I want to negotiate with Joe Biden. And they worked a compromise out together. Now, compromise isn't weakness. It's about working together and finding solutions and paths to success. That's the Joe Biden I know. And I am telling you, this is a man that can bring our country together. So taking back to your question, are we at a moment? It just depends who we elect as president in 2 weeks.
You're a very eloquent spokesman for the Biden 2020 campaign, Ambassador. I appreciate your time, your insight, as I do of all of the panelists tonight. I appreciate your opinion, your insight, your perspective. Thank you. I'd like to welcome now my longtime friend, Howard Brown, who is one of the founders of Democracy House, to close our evening. Howard, your mic's not on. Oh. I don't think we can't hear you. I'm going to give him a few more minutes.
In a moment of levity, can I ask if anyone has any insider information on where the fly is going tomorrow?
Do you think, I was going to say, do you think debates will actually this debate can actually make a difference? Mark?
I think none of these kinds of debates are, people are going to vote one or the other. They've long decided that. I think in this election, as a few of them, the undecided voters are very, very small. This is really all about bringing people out to vote, which Jamal's doing, which that's why I commend him for. Like, I don't think we changed one person's view today, to be very honest, or they're going to do that tomorrow.
Right, right. Okay, I don't think, Howard, I think we've lost you. Oh, hang on. I don't think, no, we can't hear you. I will tell you what I know about what Howard was actually going to say, and he wanted to mention Democracy House.
Alison got it. We got sound.
Okay.
So sorry about that. Let me say that I am just delighted to be speaking tonight on behalf of Democracy House, one of the organizers of this evening's event. And my job in 2 minutes is to thank our amazing moderator and panel and tell you a bit about Democracy House. This is the first public event for Democracy House. We are a new Canadian-based group dedicated to promotion of democracy and respectful political debate. I would like to thank our partners in this event, Pearson Centre and the Canadian Club of Toronto. To Alison Smith, as she said, a lifelong friend, I want to express our deepest gratitude for being such an amazing moderator. To our panelists, Ambassador Bruce Heyman from the Biden 2020 Committee, a man we've long admired for his great contribution to Canada-US relations. To Elizabeth May, one of Canada's premier parliamentarians who we've had the pleasure of watching in public life for many years and just doing a great job to advance democracy. To Jamal Watkins from the NAACP, your contribution tonight, Jamal, cannot be underestimated, and I want to thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being with us tonight. To Mark Feigenbaum from Republicans Overseas in Canada for taking on this task of having to worry about being ganged up on. I thought you represented your party well, and you represented this debate well, and I want to thank you very much. You each very much shared with us your important perspective. But more importantly, we want to thank each of you for your long-time public service and your tireless contribution to a better democracy. We are all better off because of each of you. We at Democracy House are absolutely thrilled that you could all join us for this, our first public event. We developed this event for two reasons. We believe in the importance of meaningful discussion and debate. We wanted to promote respectful dialogue as it serves to strengthen democratic systems and practices here in Canada and the US and around the world. At such an important time in the history of the relationships and the relationship between Canada and the United States, we look forward to continuing the conversation with each of you and with everyone on this call. Over 500 people signed up for this call in the months and years ahead. We at Democracy House hope you will join us for future events. Visit our website at democracyhouse.ca and sign up for our newsletter. In conclusion, I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us tonight. From the bottom of our hearts, we look forward to seeing you again. Have a great evening and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
It was a real honor to participate in this. Thank you all.
Same.
Yes,
Very
thank
much
you.
so. Take care, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
God bless
Good night.
America.